Internationally, the images of South Africa is of police mowing down mine workers at Marikana. It is service delivery protests. And then at the moment, it's this time of tacit grief as we watch the icon of South Africa's democracy ailing in hospital. And internationally, it looks like things are falling apart. Domestically, we know that that's not true. We know that whatever we may think of the state of affairs in government, there are policies, there's a judiciary that works, there is a vibrant media that holds our leaders to account, and there's a citizenry that wants to see this country succeed. Falls in education. The economy is not growing fast enough. There are issues around accountability. There's issues around oversight of the executive. But we know that things are not the way they seem internationally. The truth lies somewhere in between. And what I'm hoping we're going to do today is try to unveil that truth, try to debunk the myths, and try to get a better understanding of where we're at. So if I had to make a summation of the topic of discussion today, I would say the question we're asking at the core, gentlemen, is South Africa at a crossroads, or is South Africa at the precipice of doing something great? It just happens to be complex. What state is this country in? What would you say?
When we think about what state the economy is in today, I think it is honest to say that we have recognized the weaknesses as a country that we put ourselves in, some of which we have inherited. In the diagnostic report of the National Development Plan, it spelled out all the challenges that deprive South Africa of a higher growth rate. But what it does, which is very important for all of us, is that it says, in order to undo all the backlogs that we have identified, we cannot rely on the state to resolve those for us. The plan emphasizes that the responsibility to turn the economy around is that of every economic player or every citizen in the country. If you want growth, you can't look to the state. If you want investment, you don't have to look to the state. You need to find a niche for yourself as an individual, which is going to enable you to contribute to changing where we are. We're sitting with high levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty, and these cannot be resolved if we don't resolve the bottom line of any economy. The solution to the problems that we've identified is growth. And that means all of us need to work towards generating higher growth in the economy. And we all have a role.
Adrian Saville, what state is South Africa in?
6 out of 10, I think. 6 out of 10.
60%.
Yeah. When you pose the question, what state are we in, I think it has to it must be asked against the backdrop of, well, what state were we in? And are we in a worse state or better state than before? If we take our minds back to this country 20 years ago, we are in a unquestionably better position than 20 years ago. What we are working with now, as Elias points out, is the balance sheet that we inherited. And that balance sheet in places was deeply, deeply scarred. Obvious example, the most obvious example is education, where blacks were deliberately denied access to maths and science education. It's, to me, unsurprising that the children of these parents battle with maths and science. This is not something that is resolved overnight. The question this begs is 17, 18 years sufficient to count as more than overnight. If we measure the near-term performance of South Africa, so long run, I think we have made massive strides. If we measure where we are near-term, I don't think that we are in as great a shape as we were in the very recent past, and there is more to be done. A statesman once described South Africa as the country in which the best and the worst never happen. I think that's a wonderful description. of where we are. We are capable of so much more, and it is our task to find those paths.
Tony Leon, what state are we in?
Well, you know, I'm always amused by the comment of that legendary journalist Steve Mulholland, who said, ever since I was 5 years old, I was always told South Africa had 5 years to go until it explodes. Well, I'm now 80 and we're both still here, so I'm 56, and, you know, and I can't help but think, because today happens to be the day, when I was in grade 1, this very day, long time ago, 1963, was the raid on the Rivonia Liliesleaf Farm just down the road, when Nelson Mandela, whom obviously we all are looking at his state of health, but is admired across the world, was then, you know, along with Walter Sisulu, the most wanted man in the country, and was being hunted down. So compared to what is the great Bill Clinton said, we indeed have come a long way, not just in terms of years, but in terms of achievement. And I think that's one thing. And may I, at the risk of abusing your excellent hospitality, quote another journal and journalist, not Time magazine, good though it is, and that's the former editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, who actually I met when I was starting off my political career in the late 80s and early 90s. He was the New York Times bureau chief in Johannesburg, and of course, as many people do when they leave South Africa, he then went on to greater things. He became the editor-in-chief of the New York Times. And he came back the other day, at least in the pages of the New York Review, and he wrote a very interesting article about South Africa. And he said, if South Africa does not leave you full of ambivalence, you have obviously not been paying attention. And what he then did was list all the contradictions. And they all... So you have, you know, a communist party, I mean, perhaps the world's last communist party that operates in a democracy, which is very, you know, strong here, at least in the executive it is. And then you have an economy which is overwhelmingly capitalist, as Elias, who company, his organization controls about 20% of this building, or what comes out of this building. So you have a capitalist economy with a communist party. You have, as you correctly said at the beginning in your introductory remarks, we have a very, very admired constitution and a pretty good constitutional court, which incidentally chose to quite correctly legalize gay marriage, and yet in areas not far from here we gang rape lesbians, for example. And then you have these fantastic first world shopping centers, which we are surrounded by here, and we have millions of people living in shacks. And that is South Africa, and it's both inspiring and dispiriting. Now, I need to also just amend the title of this. You know, I'm an insider-outsider like you, because I spent many very modest results selling the opposition inside South Africa, and then spent the last few years selling South Africa and South America in 3 countries that I was accredited to. And, I mean, in some ways, South Africa is an easy sell, because we defied the odds in the teeth of very, very difficult circumstances before. And things have gone wrong in the intervening period, and we should flesh out what they are. But just in the brief period of my ambassadorship, it started on that pinnacle, which was the eve of the FIFA Football World Cup, where we surprised the world and ourselves. And I can actually prove in the hard figures how effective that was in terms of bringing tourists here, and South Africa's brand image in the world. It was a fantastic success, notwithstanding the cost. And incidentally, if you ever want a business model, just go and look at FIFA. It's the best ever. You know, they take 3 billion out of the country, they leave you with 100 million, and you spend 5 billion. So it's a world. I promise you, Elias has never found a company like FIFA that produces those sort of returns for itself. But leaving aside what it cost us, the actual add-ons for this country were unbelievable, and it was really that moment of South African exceptionalism. And then my ambassadorship was coming to an end at that terrible moment in Marikana. So, you know, it all happened in the same place, and it all happened in a very short time span. So we do stand on these pinnacles that become precipices. And the great question is, in very difficult international circumstances, which they are, we know what the growth rate is doing in the world, and in the so-called previously good-performing economies, no longer so good-performing, including our BRICS partners, how are we going to dig our way back up to the peak?
You've just introduced the core issue that I'd like us to discuss, the National Development Plan, the vision for South Africa, economic policy. I can't even keep up anymore, Elias. We've come from RDP to GEAR, now there's an NDP. We're always talking, we're always coming up with policy. That in itself suggests to me that not what they ought to be. Are we not just supposed to be implementing, not revising plans?
We know what our problems are. We need to find solutions to those problems and implement them. It is an amalgam of all the debates that we've been having as a society. What is interesting is that when we put out the diagnostics, nobody questioned the findings of the diagnostics.
You've just said the government or those who drafted the plan know what the problems are. Now we're ready to implement. If I asked you to give me in bullet point form, we know what the problems are. What have been identified as the problems?
Okay. Unfortunately, it's an array of problems. Education is one of them. Point that was made. For any successful economy, you need the right intellectual capacity to drive the economy. Investment is a problem. We're not investing enough as a country. It's about service delivery. Knowing that when you want something to be done, it's going to be done within a specific period of time. And the plan is very explicit in identifying areas of service delivery. It points right at the state and says, for the economy to be efficient, it requires the biggest player in the economy, which is government, to be efficient.
Our leaders know what the problems are. They're in a process of introspection. They know their problems with capacity and efficiency. They've identified education as a core issue. They've identified the need to foster savings and promote local investment. We've just heard it there. Does this NDP then proffer the way forward, the solutions? Is there a plan?
In our firm, we've been working in the last 3 years on a research project that seeks out to understand the common factors that exist in societies that achieve socioeconomic, sustained socioeconomic improvement. And the word socio has to be underlined, because if you have economic advance without social inclusion, you've got an accident waiting to happen. The factors that we identify have, apart from social inclusion, have a second rider, and that is they can't be discovered. It can't be gold or a rich neighbor or coal. There must be factors that can be built. And you can do a quick checklist here, and it's what leads me to my 6 out of 10 answer. The 6 factors is the country, the society must have access to savings, which is translated into functional investment, public and private sector investment. The second is you want a demography that has more people coming into the workforce than going into retirement. You need education is item. You need healthcare is item 4. You want an open economy that engages in the movement of people, information, goods, services, capital. The 6th ingredient is policy and institutional capacity. And the findings in this work really forced me to change the way I see the world as an economist. It is not the policies themselves that matter, it is the policy stability. Right. And here I think something was lost in the NDP. This is not brand new policy.
I went and reread the diagnostic overview of the NDP, which gives you the framework that is talking about. And may I indulge you by reading one of the paragraphs that absolutely struck me as the gold standard. And it says, successful countries have what is called a future orientation. Their policy bias is to take decisions that lead to long-term benefits as opposed to short-run solutions that could have negative effects later on. Such countries, as we've just heard from one of the authors, prefer investment over consumption, higher savings rates, sound fiscal policies, high levels of fixed investment, and this is, to me, the point, a high degree of policy certainty and clear rules of engagement for the private sector, to which I can only say amen. And I completely accept what Elias says, that this is a strategy to take the country to 2030. Okay. So whether you're a general running a war, a president running a country, or a CEO running a business, and anyone in between, you've got to make sure that your tactics are aligned to your strategy. So we accept the strategy. We have legislation right now, and one I've just been engaged with on a professional basis, the Mineral Petroleum Resource Development Act Amendment Bill, which is green-lighted by the same cabinet that green-lighted the NDP, which in its detail is almost a complete contradiction of what I've read out here. And I don't want to get into a row about that with people who aren't here, and maybe it will be sorted out, maybe not. But it was approved by cabinet, also approved the NDP. And I think what it certainly, whatever its other merits or demerits might be, this legislation in the key area of mining, which it addresses, And a huge new area, which is a potential windfall for South Africa, which is offshore oil and gas, actually provides uncertainty, because it takes policy and gives it to a minister and then puts huge onerous commitments on businesses, some which have never even set foot in this country, and then says, well, take your chances.
What does South Africa need to do to get to 6% growth so that we're creating 500,000 jobs per annum, so that we're lifting people out of poverty, so that children are going to school, so that there's adequate healthcare, so that we sort out the problems? What just needs to be done?
What we need to be doing as South Africans is to say, where is it that we want to be in 30 years' time? We may not be ready to get ourselves there currently, but can we adapt ourselves as a society and as an economy to get ourselves to that point?
So it doesn't work, what we're doing, and people aren't in jobs because it's very difficult to actually create the environment in which job creation should happen. And look, we can go into it, but the more difficult it is to fire people, the more difficult it's going to be to hire them. And I'm putting it very simply, there are a lot of issues in between there, but I think that's one of the issues which goes to the heart of making some tough choices.
The missing ingredient, and this is, I think, lost in many conversations, the missing ingredient is it's not growth that creates jobs, it's companies that create jobs. And South Africa has a poverty of companies. And in particular, it is small companies that create jobs. If you go to Chile as an example, Chile has a population of 17 million people, 700,000 small firms. South Africa has 50 people, 600,000 small firms. I would venture that this is the missing ingredient.
There is a hostility between government and business, and it's really broken down confidence. Just look at the mining companies, the Minister of Mines, and what's happened since Marikana. It's that kind of animosity that characterizes the relationship, and herein lies the problem.
One of the biggest constraints for the continental economy today is power. If we don't invest appropriately in power, the likelihood is that the economy that we're looking at in the rest of the continent will never get to where it's supposed to. We're looking at food, we're looking at water, which you may think are basic investment areas, but are critical for making sure that the rest of the productive sector, which is the private sector in this case, increases its productivity going forward. Now, to answer your question, the way in which we think about our role as the PIC is not to question the policy environment that we're in. Our role is to engage with the policy environment in order to enhance the space in which we're operating.
I think all of us are making this point around education. For 144 countries in the world, we rank 134 out of 144 for basic education. We rank 143 out of 144 for maths and science. Maths and science are tomorrow's engineers, innovators, builders, doers. This is a national crisis.
The PIC started investing in cement, and they've spread their wings further than the boundaries of South Africa. They're in Nigeria, and they're penetrating Africa. And that speaks to the growth story, even if South Africa is underperforming. There is a sense, Tony Leon, that if South Africa wants to grow, if we want that 6%, it's time for South African businesses and the South African public to engage the reality of South Africa being in Africa and not being an exclusive enclave at the tip of the African continent.
Well, I think both parts of your question are actually valid. I think there is South African engagement in Africa. I mean, we do have a lot of our companies in Africa, particularly in the retail sector, in the banking sector, and the hospitality sector. They're increasingly going to Africa, and the returns are very good because, as you say, I mean, notwithstanding the global cratering of growth, overall continental growth in Africa is about 4.8% when you adjust it for PPP purposes, so that's pretty good.
Is Africa the answer to many of South Africa's problems?
Looking at it from a perspective, yes, it is. There is no doubt that with a slowing global economy, we need to look for new markets somewhere. Now, the way in which we think about our entry into the rest of the continent, unlike what the bulk of the private sector does, it's not for pricing purposes. But there's no doubt that all the corporates, South African corporates that have gone to the rest of the continent, are realizing better returns there than at home, simply because of the pricing power that they have there. Our view goes beyond that. And our view is going to the rest of the continent to invest for growth, to invest for the creation of new markets for SA Inc. We are taking a long-term view on the continent. And we're saying, yes, there are risks that we understand as the PIC. It's the first time in 102 years that we're allowed to invest outside of the borders of South Africa. We're venturing into unfamiliar territory. But we are saying we are not trying to understand this continental economy over the next 2 to 3 years. We want to partner with the rest of the continent for a very long period of time. Now, what also distinguishes us from other people going to the rest of the continent, we're not going in there with the aim to conquer. We're going in there with the aim to develop partnerships which are going to be beneficial to both sides. It cannot be about South Africa only. And we always caution when we engage on this matter that one of the things that we are erratic on as South Africans is the language that we use. And part of that language revolves around how South Africa positions itself relative to the continent. The phrase about South Africa being the gateway to Africa needs to stop.
We'll have a conversation about diplomacy later. We'll engage you, Tony, about how best to approach Africa. But are there pitfalls in South Africa's expansion into the rest of Africa? And I'm talking here both ways. Are there things South Africa needs to be concerned about and things the rest of Africa needs to be concerned about?
The short answer is yes. If I can build on Elias's observations around this and hopefully then get to answering your question more fully. Recently, I authored with a colleague, Lyle White, the Visa African Integration Index, where we were measuring exactly that. How much business do African economies do with each other? And how sophisticated is that business? There were some notable observations, I think, that come out of our findings. Some of them are the following. That of the 11 countries that we surveyed, which represent about 80% of Sub-Saharan Africa's GDP, of those 11 countries, South Africa ranks third from the bottom in terms of doing business with neighbors. Second, geography is a permanent competitive advantage. And whilst we can certainly be concerned about, the Chinese are coming and so on, if geography is a permanent competitive advantage, we squander it. It truly is a wasteful loss that we willingly give away. We are a province in the fastest growing subcontinent in the world, and we are worrying about opportunities. I think we are surrounded by opportunities. The evidence suggests that we aren't seizing them because we are not doing business with our neighbors. The region that we can learn the most from in this regard, I would venture, is the East African community. And it's unsurprising to me that the East African community is growing at 6%, sustained 6%. They have done a number of things that engage each other and engage others, landing vast tracts of bandwidth, pulling down borders, so it's very easy to do business with neighbors. I think the next step is common currency in the region.
Let's go beyond Africa and go abroad. Tony Leon, global economy, the outlook isn't particularly good. We know that some southern countries are going to stay in recession. We know the Eurozone's still got a few challenges. And we also know that how ratings agencies view South Africa in this broad context isn't very favorable. So when you evaluate everything that's happening internationally with everything we've spoken about locally in South Africa, what are the prospects?
Well, there your optimism does get tested because, we all coupled together on the tote, as we used to say in racing, and the interconnectedness creates its own problems and opportunities. And, we've been spent a lot of this afternoon talking about our own situation, about policy-making decisions and good and bad. I mean, that is one of the things. I think the underrated achievement of the very slow recovery from that terrible 2007, 2008 is what's happened in the United States, quite frankly. Because there, I mean, the policy interventions were, you can argue enough, but they did turn things around to some extent, even starting with President Bush and TARP. They got better under President Obama, but were frustrated by the Congress. And then, of course, you had Ben Bernanke, who played a key role with quantitative easing. Now, which has now got America, because America has its own plus factors, which anyone who's been there knows, about productivity and innovation and all those things, and R&D, which we just don't see in other parts of the world to the same extent. America's now, we've seen on the latest figures coming out of their labor market, is starting to show at what you might call a middling recovery. Well, that creates opportunities for us, but also dangers. And the big danger, of course, is that the value of the dollar has increased as they're going to taper off quantitative easing, and therefore the search for yield, which used to help our currency and our foreign investment inflows, is now going in the other direction, which creates other, but with every one of these challenges and potential crises, advantage. So we know that. Your currency is too high, it's very difficult for manufacturing export. Your currency starts, going down, it creates opportunities, risks, and reward. So I think, it's a question of how you position yourself relative to that global uncertainty. But I do think if you look at the United States, and the Congress is not an example of policy decision-making, but if you look at Europe, Europe is absolutely fixated on austerity economics. I think that's creating further problems in the Eurozone. I'm an amateur economist, not a serious professional one like the gentleman here, or a major investor like the gentleman further to my right, geographically only, not ideologically. But, I mean, the point is that Europe is staying in a very, very low growth situation because they've decided that austerity economics is going to be the alpha and omega for the future. We have not quite decided on what our emphatic policy response to all of this. We have some policies and they contradict each other. And I think if I was to say one thing about positioning ourselves in the world is to go back to the issue of policy certainty and then sticking to it. So you actually put your stall out there and you say, okay, here's my stand and I go no further and no one comes across this line.
The word bad is not what we should be using to describe South Africa, but rather challenging, because in the midst of it all, there are some good stories that are unfolding, and if we built on those, we'd be developing a much better country. That's my sense of the conversation we've just had. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Elias Masilela, the CEO of the PIC, Public Investment Corporation, to Adrian Saville, who is a visiting professor at Gibbs and also the Chief Investment Officer at Cannon Asset Management, and of course irreverent, fun and challenging Tony Leon, former opposition leader, diplomat to South America for South Africa, and now a writer and a columnist by his book.
Tonight's top business stories. Shoprite shares take a battering after its local growth is trimmed.